Hi everybody and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. This episode we're winding down from 420 by taking a look at how the coverage of cannabis has changed over the past 10 years. My guest this week is the country's first mainstream cannabis editor, founder of the Cannabist by the Denver Post, Ricardo Baca. Now he's founded Grasslands, a journalism-minded agency, and he's also on the Colorado Advisory Board for Natural Medicine. But back in 2013, Ricardo was tasked with leading the coverage for the highly stigmatized topic of cannabis for the first major media outlet that wanted to take it seriously at the dawn of legalization. The job posting got plenty of slack at the time, from SNL to all the nightly talk shows. And when Ricardo was named the person to that position, he faced a lot of pushback as well, from both prohibitionists and from people in the cannabis industry. And of course, he faced huge amounts of stigma from most of society at the time. But despite the hate, Ricardo and his team forged ahead with their complex new beat. And with their coverage at the Cannabist, they were forever changing how journalists of the future would cover cannabis and what readers might think about it. Today, we're going to talk about what it was like for Ricardo as the first person at the helm at the very start of mainstream cannabis journalism. We're going to talk about what kinds of stories he remembers covering at the start of legalization, what he's seen change over the last decade with how major outlets cover cannabis industry and culture, and where he sees the future of cannabis going and how journalism plays a part in that evolution. We'll be right back with the first US cannabis editor, Ricardo Baca. So really what I want to know about, Ricardo, is you and your background and your experience as the first US cannabis editor for a major newspaper, because now we're seeing cannabis covered in some very, very different ways to how it was done back then, when everybody was super shocked that the Denver Post would dare to take cannabis seriously enough to cover it as an actual industry. So let's talk about you first. What did you do before you were at the Denver Post, and then what did you do once you joined the Denver Post?
Yeah, in college, I studied journalism and theater. I thought I wanted to become a theater critic. But I knew I wanted to be a journalist no matter what. I was drawn to journalism, going back to having ink-stained hands as a teenager delivering the Rocky Mountain News in the suburbs of Denver. So it was a really natural draw. I could always write, always stronger in English classes than math. But it really came down to a really amazing internship that I got and a scholarship from the Rocky Mountain News that really opened up this field to me. And I worked for the Rocky, which was a great newspaper that's no longer still around. Worked for them for the 4 years of college. Ended up in Corpus Christi, Texas, of all places, where I ended up as the pop culture critic for a small daily newspaper down there called the Caller-Times. And then I was fortunate enough to get called back to Denver, my hometown, where I worked at the Denver Post for 13 years. And I was the music critic, I was the entertainment editor, and finally, I was the cannabis editor. And that happened, of course, a couple months right before the world's first adult use sales kicked in. The newspaper knew that we needed to cover cannabis differently, moving from an era of prohibition to an era of adult use. And so they really wanted me to tackle that, recognizing we were going to cover the fun, the lifestyle, the entertainment, while also covering the breaking news and the investigative journalism.
Why do you think you were chosen for the job? Do you think that there was some profiling going on with the guy who's into like the music scene, the art scene, the culture scene? Like, why do you think that you were put on this list of folks that could do this job?
It's funny. I did tell the editor at the time, I am far from the biggest stoner in the newsroom. And they said, yeah, we're aware. And they're like, that's kind of a pro and a con. But at the end of the day, it really came down to the journalistic bona fides and experience. They knew that at that time, I already had more than 20 years of full-time experience working in newspapers. They knew that I had already run complex beats and created large, complicated events. I'd started a music blog called Reverb, which is now known as The Know. I started a music festival called the UMS, the Underground Music Showcase, and it's entering its 23rd year this summer.
Wow.
And I started that and ran it for its first 16, 17 years. So in doing all of that, the journalism and all of the ancillary culture aspects around it, my bosses at the time, they knew that I wasn't going to embarrass them when it came to this immensely complicated beat of covering cannabis for a mainstream daily newspaper at the dawn of legalization. We're talking 2013, and it was a very different time then, to your point. It was very much still pre-normalization. The
Yeah.
stigma was very present. It's fun, even looking at recent pictures of the first dispensary opening in New York State, which is our clients over at Housing Works Cannabis. As people were doing that in late December, people were so excited to be in that line and they were talking to media. And if you compare December of 2022 to January 1st, 2014 in Denver, wildly different scenarios, because I had to talk to 10, 12 people in line at the dispensary to find one person willing to go on the record about being a cannabis consumer. So everything
Wow.
has changed in that time, and it's been thrilling to watch that change. And really, I'm just proud to have been a small part of it.
That's incredible. You've seen so much change just in the cultural acceptance of cannabis, not just in the way that you'll cover it for the newspaper, but in the way that people will interact with it and be honest with you about their interactions with it. I want to loop back a little bit to when the Cannabist was first started. What was the thinking when you got in the room with the other editors and you were discussing, like, we need to make this a legitimate coverage of this subject, which is a new industry, there's new business that's going to come out of it, there's new laws, but you've got all this stigma. There were late night hosts that had a real great fun with the idea that there was going to be a cannabis editor. Like, the stigma was everywhere for you. What was that discussion like on how you would focus the coverage, that you would really be kind of setting the example for the rest of the news?
Yeah, of course. I'm very thankful to have worked with some true media visionaries, including Greg Moore, who was our editor-in-chief at the time, formerly of the Boston Globe, and also Kevin Dale, who was our news director at the time, and now he's with Colorado Public Radio running their news station. But they both recognized in those waning days of 2013 that this site, whatever it ended up looking like, had to be an equal mixture of culture, lifestyle, and hard news investigative, which I was really thankful for because, journalism doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to reporting on cannabis over the decades, right?
Yeah.
In journalism school, you're taught to, of course, find the authorities on a subject matter, the most trusted entities and individuals, and quote them, recognizing that they are going to represent the larger thinking. And of course, there's 2, 3, 4 sides to every issue. And so we recognized what we needed to do. And one of those big recognitions was that journalism had failed its readers for decades, primarily because we were still quoting individuals and officials from the federal government when it came to this plant. And the truth was they had a vested interest in continuing this misinformation campaign. And so we made a very conscientious effort to recognize that, yeah, there are still people who are against cannabis prohibition. And in those early days, we didn't have the public health data that we have now to really combat most of their most common arguments. What about the children and everything?
Yeah.
But we were going to give them a position and a voice at the table, but we were also not going to quote them when they were repeating propaganda and misinformation that had already been misproven. And at the same time, we were going to take a brand new, very modern approach to this, recognizing that there will be goods and bads of cannabis legalization. We're going to report on that equally. And in addition to the news and the investigative journalism, we're also going to have fun with it. We're going to hire multiple pot critics who are going to review individual strains from specific cultivation facilities. And we're going to hire an edibles critic. We're going to hire a cookbook author who cooks with cannabis and who's really thoughtful. And all of this early Cannabist crew from 2014, 2015, it's really thrilling to see all of those individuals as they blossomed their own careers throughout the kind of ecosystem of cannabis. They're all
Yeah.
over the place, working with plant touching, working with ancillary, and really all the genesis of everything was back then when we were figuring out what this publication was going to look like. And I think the greatest compliment we ever got paid was there's a great think tank in DC called the Brookings Institution. And they came out in, I believe, April of 14 or 15, just saying that, hey, this ragtag group of journalists at the Denver Post is forever changing how journalists will cover weed. And that was
Yes.
huge. And I think it's very, very true. You look at how people were covering weed in 13 and before, and we had to change that. We not only did we owe it to our readers, but we owed it to our profession. I mean, journalism should be holding the powerful to account, as well as only quoting verified authorities as sources. So we really did have to change things up. And it was great to kind of get that recognition.
That's amazing to really change the way from one small team that you start with to really change the way that things are being covered and presented and, helping, I think, develop people's understanding of the history of cannabis as well by questioning those sources and telling people that cannabis coverage can be done reliably and with journalistic integrity, but it can still be fun and entertaining, can still talk about the culture. What a cool job to be the first edible tester for the Denver Post. That would have been a cool job, especially like back in 2013. That's dope. So speaking of your team, I mean, after you spawned this journalist crew of cannabis coverage at the Post, we saw a lot of other newspapers start to really take cannabis more seriously as an industry that needed to be covered. Like the Boston Globe got their team together when cannabis was legalized in Massachusetts in 2017. There was the Philadelphia Inquirer, the LA Times, Politico. You mentioned that not everybody wanted to be covered, not everybody wanted to talk to you. What was it like watching the growth of other places where they had cannabis teams in other cities? Did people seem more likely to talk to folks in other places? Was this a normal phenomenon that nobody wanted to discuss weed yet?
Oh, without a doubt. And it's very much geographical and on a timeline, right? Because you do have these hubs of progressive drug policy reform throughout the country, primarily California. I've always been amazed at traveling to California, talking with just normal citizens, normal everyday consumers. You're sitting next to somebody at a bar or in a restaurant, and normalization in California is like nothing else that exists throughout the country.
Yeah.
Colorado's pretty far along. And then, of course, the further east you get, the further into antiquated thinking you get. And of course, normalization is still in its infancy there because it's taking its time. And sure, they've had the opportunity to see legal environments play out in Colorado throughout the West Coast. And that has to give them a little bit of safety and respect and understanding. And yet, misinformation, it's really hard to combat when you were fed that misinformation for so long by people you loved and people you trusted. I remember when I first started digging into the subject of cannabis, thinking, okay, I'm going to be reporting on this. I need to have a better understanding on it. I mean, I was 10 minutes in before my mind was already blown. I'd
Right, I
never
bet.
really thought about it before, but suddenly I'm like, oh, okay. So basically, everything I was taught by my parents, by my middle school teachers who I loved, and by my mentors was totally BS. It has no rooting in reality. This is a non-toxic plant. This is a safe substance. Sure, it's not without its risks, but those risks are lower than pretty much every other recreational substance on the market. I mean, we lose more than 70,000 Americans every year to alcohol-related causes. And the same organization that gives us that statistic, the Centers for Disease Control, they tell us that nobody's ever died from cannabis. So learning about that was really transformative for me. And I really took that role as an educator really seriously. And I do think that's a primary role of journalism, is to educate the masses and to inform them that what they've been taught is wrong. It's kind of like going back to my first TED Talk where I said, hey, we all need to push Control Alt Delete on our brains because
Mm-hmm.
everything you know about weed most likely is wrong. And so it has been fascinating to watch the rollout state by state. And of course, we're waiting for that federal legalization. We really need that. But in the meantime, it's been encouraging to see more and more states move forward. Such a bummer to see Oklahoma say no to recreational last week. But
Yeah.
at the same time, that happens, and there will continue to be progress across the Bible Belt, across the American South. And with more progress, with more education, we will see more normalization, more acceptance. And I think the best example of that is seeing some of these encouraging data coming out that's telling us that the single hardest demographic to convince about the medical efficacy of cannabis, which is, of course, the greatest generation, it's the senior citizens.
Right.
They are among the fastest adopting groups using cannabis and really starting to recognize that these topicals they put on their skin, this is game changing. This is life changing, especially for them, because of course our bodies and our health starts to deteriorate as we get into our elder years. And I think that's a true metric. The more impact and the more penetration we can make in those kinds of demographics, the less misinformation will win. And at the same time, it was 80 years of propaganda. It's going to take a bit to overcome that.
Yeah. And one of the only ways to do it is for already trusted media organizations to take cannabis seriously as a topic and a subject and an industry as we're watching it grow. There are so many angles that you can talk about when you're doing cannabis coverage. I found, similarly, as you were saying, with the East Coast, West Coast difference, when I started covering cannabis here on the East Coast, I covered Massachusetts, the first dispensaries to open in 2018, and people in line there did not want to talk to me because I told them that I was from an iHeartRadio station. This was when I had a different show, Blunt Talk, and people did not want to talk to me. They didn't want to tell me their names, but they would tell me things like, I've come from New York, I've come from Connecticut, and I've driven over here just to buy the first day. I want to be part of history. And they'd quite freely tell me that they're driving across state lines with their weed, but but they were like, I won't tell you my name, I won't tell you exactly where I'm from because, what if my boss hears this? I've called out sick. Like, it was so strange. And I'd come from California where these sorts of dispensary openings were no longer a big deal that everybody went to. And they certainly weren't the things that you would avoid talking about, like, the culture on the East Coast to the West Coast is very different. I guess as legalization hops state to state, we'll start to see these kinds of areas normalize, as you're saying. I was also really surprised that Oklahoma said no. I think it's because they outspent them on the no campaign like 20-1.
Oh, really? Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And Britt, to your point about California, it truly is an enlightened state of being, and it's not just the everyday consumer. I was amazed in the early days of adult use in California, talking to the state's first cannabis regulator, Lori Ajax, and talking to her about even something like social use and public consumption. It was not a big deal to Lori. She had previously run the state's Bureau of Alcohol. And she talked very openly about, of course, we're going to have consumption lounges. And of course, we'll eventually have hotels where you can smoke in your room and have it sanctioned consumption on patios. This was a given. And I just so admire that about our brothers and sisters in California, because the way they approach this is from a more realistic and modern purview. Whereas we've had legal weed in Colorado for 10 plus years now, legal adult use. Of course, we were the first in the world to do it. And we're just now getting around to opening consumption lounges. And frankly, it's embarrassing, this puritanical approach. It's obscene, but it does go back to that core issue of how do we reprogram our brains and our communities and still be aware of the potential risks that are out there for it.
Absolutely. So you mentioned a few of the stories that you covered during your time with the Cannabist. What was the most memorable story to you that you covered or that somebody under you covered while the Cannabist was going on from sort of the really early days of cannabis journalism?
Yeah, I'll name two quickly, but the first one was when I first partnered with a state licensed cannabis testing lab to test various edibles for their potency. This was in the first 3 months of the legal market. I forged this relationship early on and brought in 10 different edibles and tested them all for how many milligrams of activated THC are actually in them compared to what's being listed on the label. And I thought
Right.
that was really important because it was a brand new substance that a lot of people were not familiar with. And frankly, never in the world had it ever existed in a format where a regulatory body was actually overseeing the production of this and saying, okay, that chocolate bar is 100 milligrams. And so that was a really enlightening piece, and it led to an executive order from the governor. It led to an expedited process from the Department of Regulatory Agencies because they weren't mandatory testing any adult use products at the time. And
Mm.
I just thought that was a really valid flex of what we could do as journalists, partnering with the industry, these testing labs, to really hold these brands accountable to make sure that consumers were getting what they were paying for and to make sure that they were figuring out their proper dose, because of course that's really complicated when you're entering a regulated market for the first time. And that testing story very much led naturally into a story about a year and a half later where I brought in 8 different concentrated products and we tested those at a state licensed lab for the presence of all of this stuff. Primarily, it was checking into seeing which of the active ingredient pesticides that were being illegally used in cultivation facilities were still present in that end product of
Mm.
whether it was shatter or wax or live resin or rosin. And so we took them in and we ultimately found a lot of disconcerting things, certainly found some heavy metals, found some residual solvents. But the main thing was recognizing that just as when you concentrate the plant into a oil or a dabbable concentrate, you are really concentrating and elevating the levels of cannabinoids and terpenes, but you're also concentrating the levels of anything else that's already in there. And so we found that a lot of these grows were having moments where they were almost losing their entire crops. And so they would bring in traditional agriculture or garden pesticides and they were using them on cannabis when they should not have been.
Mm.
And then they were ultimately concentrating the amount of that active chemical ingredient when they were concentrating the cannabis, and it was ultimately creating a public health disaster. That reporting also led to an executive order from our governor at the time. He said this is a public health emergency and we need to get on top of it. And it started an important conversation. One thing I didn't realize it was going to lead to was my reporting there led to the state's first recall, one of the first recalls of cannabis in the modern era. And that first recall led to about 50 or 60 other recalls, primarily because of seed to sale tracking. They could go back to the
Wow.
original plant matter that had that active ingredient on it and say, okay, well, not only did it go to this manufacturer who made that concentrate, it also went to these 10 other shops and it was a spider web. And we were still covering recalls 9, 10 months later, definitely 50 plus recalls from that one piece of journalism. And so that was my one of the some of the most important work I did. I really found that I wanted to protect public health. And I also wanted to hold the government accountable to make sure that they were there to have our backs as a consuming public with this new substance, but really just holding the powerful accountable wherever they were. I really think about those two pieces quite often.
Wow, that's incredibly important work. And I don't think that folks took it seriously at first when they said that there was going to be a cannabis reporter, or a cannabis editor, as to just what that could lead to. And I think that's really been an undervalued part of early cannabis journalism, that you caught issues like that that could impact people's health. Did you have any piece, any article, any reporting that you did that was received a lot of negative feedback, or that there was a lot of stigma over, anything that you had to really fight through?
Oh, plenty. I mean, even like the very announcement of my appointment, like going back to November of 2013, when the Denver Post announced that they hired me as the cannabis editor, by that point, the position had already been on Saturday Night Live and The Tonight Show. just because somebody took a picture of the job posting in the newsroom. It went viral on Twitter, and next thing you know, it's in Weekend Update, which was pretty funny. But then I was announced as that editor, as that figurehead. And immediately the industry, there was an outcry in the industry. They wanted the Post to hire somebody from the industry to cover the industry, which is to say they didn't understand journalism. No newspaper, no legitimate news organization would ever do that, because journalism is a field of study where you have to practice it for years until you can actually execute. And so, of course, they were going to hire an experienced journalism to take on this complex beat. But the controversy started from the start, and it didn't end until the very end when I resigned to start Grasslands. And so it really was a trip. A couple things that definitely stand out was, reporting on the prohibitionists. I did a story on that was basically using that journalistic tactic of follow the money. And if we think back to 2014, there were a rash of lawsuits that were being pitched and positioned in front of the Supreme Court, including from attorneys general in Oklahoma and Nebraska and Kansas, who said that their law enforcement costs were skyrocketing because of all the residents going into Colorado and then crossing state lines illegally with product that was not legal over there. They took that to the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately said, no, we're not doing that. We're not taking it. But so I wanted to get to the heart of those lawsuits. And I ultimately followed the money and found that a majority of the money was coming from these East Coast law firms and organizations, many of which were linked with corporations and entire categories of business that would benefit from a continued prohibition. You think about drug testing laboratories. I mean, they have been sitting on a gold mine for years because of this unjust US cannabis prohibition. And suddenly, when it's legal in Colorado and California, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of adults who are no longer being tested for cannabis, and that's lost revenue, and they were fighting this. So it was fascinating to do that, but also to recognize that the prohibitionists were coming after me and saying that I was in the pocket of industry. However, when I was also reporting and holding industry accountable, and doing tests on the potency of edibles or on the active ingredient chemicals and concentrates that should have never been there in the first place, that's when the industry was coming after me and saying, oh, Baca, you're in the pocket of these prohibitionists in the government. And as you know, Brit, that's how you know you're doing your job correctly as a journalist, when you have people on both sides bitching that you are in the pocket of the other side.
That's exactly when you know you're doing the right thing. You're covering the right tracks. Yeah, everybody's mad at you. I mean, you've seen so much change in the last 10 plus years since you started covering the cannabis industry and watching the culture. What do you think people care about differently now than they did when you started covering cannabis?
It's a really thoughtful question, because I think people's passions have changed dramatically over that time. At the time, we didn't even know what a recreational dispensary was going to look like. So our reporting had to start at that base foundational level. And in many ways, I know you and I talked about this over dinner in Boston recently, but it is fascinating to see a state come online, stand up a program, and to see these these signpost stories that happen in every legal market, because I think it is so consistent and it is ultimately pretty formulaic. You plug in a legal cannabis ecosystem, and especially since every state in the union is ultimately using some version of the Colorado model, because our regulators wrote it first, implemented it first, and everybody takes that and starts adding and taking away. Of course, you're going to end up with these similarities. But I think the biggest changes I've seen in terms of the cannabis journalism that's being produced, but also what readers are interested in learning, comes along with that normalization. Because previously, imagine January 1st, 2014, we knew that the Colorado state legislature at the time considered a legal dose of edible marijuana as 10 milligrams. But we really didn't know if that was rooted in reality. I mean, you have lawmakers kind of making this decision. And so we were kind of testing that out. And honestly, to be truthful, I still think that the dose should be closer to 5 milligrams. It's much better for newbies and first timers, and then you can always titrate up. But now we're dealing with a much more savvy consumer. And I love that because I know you're a fan of the cannabis plant, and I'm a massive fan of it too. What a beautiful, magical plant that has given us so much. And now there's so much to explore and learn. And of course,
Mm.
research is completely hamstrung, and we're really getting screwed there that we can't conduct large scale clinical trials that will teach us so much more about this plant and about its many, many medical uses. I mean, already you have the Journal of the American Medical Association, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, some of the most stringent medical organizations in the world coming out and saying cannabis is efficacious medicine,
Yeah.
for spasticity, for seizures, for chronic pain. And that alone is amazing when you think about how many Americans struggle with chronic pain. But really, even though we're lacking that research, we're doing our own personal research. And that's what people want to understand.
Mm.
They are moving on from just having questions about what is THC to having questions about what are these other five cannabinoids and what role do terpenes play in the mix? What role do mixing agents play in the vapes that we consume on a regular basis? And what are the differences between these vapes, the ones that are mostly metal and the ones that are mostly ceramic?
Yeah.
I love that the consumer is becoming savvier and that the industry is being held more accountable, because that ultimately means we're seeing the good actors thriving and we're seeing those who can't keep up not being able to stick around, especially with some of the downturns we've seen in these markets.
That's interesting. I think that you're right about there being a more savvy consumer. And because of that, I think that folks are getting more involved and more interested in cannabis culture. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that people have a higher demand to see a policy change to allow them to have social places to smoke,
Yes.
to allow public consumption, those kinds of things, because it's becoming more normal now to be able to go to a friend's party and to have brought along whatever you bought from the local dispensary. And, like the way that we're enjoying cannabis is changing. And of course, the more states allow it, the more normalized it's becoming, and the more interested people are in watching the reporting on how they can legally access it now. So now you've left the Denver Post and you've started Grasslands, a journalism-minded agency, and you guys do marketing and PR, events. Oh my gosh, your events are off the charts. What are you doing now, and what do you have coming up in the future?
Oh yeah. It is Grasslands, which has been so much fun. A little bit more than 6 years ago, I left the Post. I resigned from 13 years of that newspaper, 24 years in daily newspapers, to found Grasslands, and that was I wanted to create a PR and marketing agency that was a little bit more modern and a little bit more attuned to those target audiences of recognizing that journalists are massively overworked right now and they need help. They need more help than they've ever needed. And so we are there for our journalist partners, always trying to be the best that we can be, but also recognizing that there was a lot to be desired from the client side as it related to their agency partners. And so as I was getting ready to leave the Post and the Cannabist, I did some due diligence and was kind of amazed that there were just nothing but complaints as it related to agency partners. And so I knew that we could do this differently and stepped in, starting with content marketing and moving into thought leadership marketing, two things that I knew how to do. Only at this point, I was writing for other people and ghostwriting under other names. And then I always knew we wanted to add a public relations department, and we did that pretty quickly on. And now PR is our largest, most successful department. We work with some great brands, including Cookies, including Puffco, Grodan, Willie's Reserve, some really fantastic brands that are national, international. And I really love being on this side of the ball. I feel like I gave my all to journalism for 24 years and really cut my teeth and paid my dues. And now I'm very excited about exploring this new side of the media paradigm and also elevating the traditional agency work so we can be better partners to our clients and better partners to our journalist friends who are dealing with unforeseen circumstances. So we really love what we do at Grasslands, and that's been a blast. And in the meantime, too, I've been experimenting with my own inner activist, Brit, and
Mm.
it really has been a first time thing for me because I have been a journalist since I was 18 years old, which means you can't put that bumper sticker on your car, you can't put the sign in your yard, and You can't go to the fundraiser. And now I'm hosting political fundraisers for the Colorado Secretary of State or the Attorney General, whoever my goals and values align with. I love being a part of that process. I love being a part of various boards of directors. Right now, I'm on the board of directors for Colorado Public Radio, which has 3 FM channels in Colorado and is a kick-ass NPR affiliate and is one of the fastest growing news gathering organizations in the country, which of course is near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
And then something very cool just happened in the last month. Governor Polis out here in Colorado appointed me to the state's advisory board for natural medicine, which means that myself and 14 others, mostly PhDs, will be putting together some suggested regulations for implementing Proposition 122 from November, which is, of course, when we decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms and other psychedelics statewide. And we're just getting started with that process. We're awaiting Senate confirmation, which is coming up in the next few weeks. And after that, it's off to the races to start this immensely important work.
Oh my gosh, that is super exciting. I didn't know that bit, Ricardo. That is cool.
Breaking news.
Congratulations. News breaking right here. Well, at least to me. That's incredible. How exciting. You've watched so much change with our relationship with cannabis and then now into psychedelics. And you're just, I feel like I'm going to want to pick your brain for the next 30, 40, 50 years just to see how much is changing over all of this time with how we interact with the plants around us and how it affects our culture. I think it's just fascinating and so great to be able to pick your incredibly knowledgeable brain on this fascinating topic. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, well, Brit, thank you for having me. And I will say, as frustrating as this laboratories of democracy, state by state rollout of legal cannabis laws is, one of the beautiful unintended consequences of it is really the development of these subject matter experts and documenters of cultures and journalism. Because sure, I did that in Colorado in 2014, but you're doing that now in Massachusetts and throughout the East Coast. So I want to thank you for your commitment and the great work you've done. It is absolutely necessary to spread truth. Speak truth to power. And I know that you absolutely agree. And I want to shout you out for the excellent work that you've done and the amazing career you've had.
Thank you so much. That's so very kind. And I appreciate you for laying the way for folks like me. A massive thanks to our guest this episode, Ricardo Baca of Grasslands, a journalism-minded agency, formerly of the Denver Post's The Cannabist. Next week, we'll be taking a trip to the Lone Star State to discover how cannabis and hemp culture has been growing into something really special deep in the heart of Texas. There are CBD shops everywhere. There's CBD sold in gas stations, grocery stores, head shops. But if you really want to seek out some good cannabis products, albeit low THC, it seems like there are some pretty cool little dispensaries out here as well. And I've come across one in South Austin. There are live resin gummies. You can get salted caramel with Delta 8 here. CBD heavy flower, vape cartridges, and they've got names like Blue Dream, Pineapple Express, OG Kush, Wedding Cake, all those names that we know. The only difference is here they're Delta 8 THC, a little bit of Delta 9 THC mixed with mostly CBD or CBN. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you're listening right now so you don't miss the next episode. And follow us on social media at Different Leaf, and I'm on social media at Brit the British. Make sure to grab your spring cultural issue of Different Leaf the magazine, which just hit newsstands at select retailers, and it's available at differentleaf.com.